You're listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm here with Dr. Melissa Guzman, Assistant Professor in the Latina, Latino, Latinx Studies Department at San Francisco State University. Dr. Guzman earned her PhD from the Sociology Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Guzman's research focuses on racialization, Latino, Latina sociology, migration, religion, and the criminalization of communities of color. She currently teaches undergraduate courses that focuses on race, crime, and juvenile justice. An article about her ethnographic work on migration and religion is titled Spiritual Citizenship, Immigrant Religious Participation and the Management of Deportability, published in the International Migration Review. She's currently working on articles and a book manuscript about the collateral consequences of mass incarceration in the lives of evangelical Latina communities across Central and Northern California. I've invited Melissa to talk about being a woman of color faculty member in the academy, about mentoring, about her research on migration and religion, and much more. Welcome, Melissa, to Voces Críticas.
Thank you, Silvana. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about this transition from UC graduate student to CSU faculty member. What's that been like for you, and what has the transition taught you about yourself?
One of the most important things has been making sure that I develop good writing habits, because when you're in grad school, you have this project that's sort of in the making. The habit that I carried through from UC Santa Barbara to being a new faculty has been to really be careful about setting my writing goals and to make sure that I do my best to carve space to write as much as possible, especially being at a place like San Francisco State where the focus is on teaching and doing service. Writing and research can take the background space, and then sometimes you're just so exhausted. If I don't deliberately make time to write, time just ends up going by. And it's sort of similar to like the pressure that I was feeling in graduate school where like someday I'll finish this PhD. But here you really have to advocate for yourself, and you have to remember, I already have this project.
This transition, I think, is actually far more difficult than I myself had realized. I really underestimated how exhausted I would feel after a lecture. And then the last thing you want to do is write. Did you kind of have the same experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because right after I graduated, I didn't transition into a tenure track job. I was lecturing. And so I think during those first classes that I was lecturing for, it was kind of my first time really preparing syllabi, learning to manage my time better. And I was applying to different tenure track positions while I was teaching. And so I think lecturing in that sense really helped me know what it would be like once I got a tenure track job.
Mentoring is a major discussion in our profession. What has been your experience with mentoring, whether it be forms of peer mentoring or with senior scholars that have been important to you? What have you learned from these mentoring experiences?
Remember that this mentoring relationship is a lifelong process. When you're in graduate school, or even when I was an undergrad, I remember being in the Ronald D. McNair program. That was our little training ground for how to do research. And I went to a state school. And so that was one of the first times that I even heard about graduate school. And we had to find a faculty mentor. And I still keep in touch with my undergrad faculty mentors from over 10 years ago. It goes beyond just asking for rec letters. It's really, how are you going to survive as a first-generation student of color who has 1 to 3 jobs, like trying to pay through school? By honing those relationships, I'm also teaching myself to reach out to others. And remember that, especially in graduate school, with professors like Dr. Denise Segura, for example, thinking about some of the first-generation women of color feminist scholars who paved the way for all of us to have a seat in those programs and who have fought for us to continue doing our work and to, be professors. We have gotten that empowerment from them. And so how do we make sure that we keep the door open for other students? A question that I have for you. How do you make sure that you continue that ongoing holding the door open for other students?
The thing that I do is trying to really think now in the post-tenure life, what kind of leadership roles can I take on that enable me to actually open up the institution in ways that if I were not in that role, I couldn't do. I think some of the work that I'm doing now, I couldn't do as an assistant professor, mostly because there was no time. But now I feel, okay, this is a different ballgame now. So Melissa, what words of advice would you give women of color academics?
I think one of the most important things is to find a project that you are really passionate about, that you really care about. And of course, it depends on the kind of program that you're in. But for example, in mine at UC Santa Barbara Sociology, a lot of us were focusing on doing ethnographic research that was really rooted in all kinds of different community struggles. And it just felt really open. Taking care of yourself is another thing that I would tell a new woman of color in academia. Make sure that you make the most of your time, not only attending class and giving your best in the program, but also nourishing the relationships that you're going to build there, because that's really what gets you through. And not only with your mentors and faculty, but really your cohort and other students that will accompany you even past the time that you're in grad school. Envision your future academic goals and life goals with a community of people that you find there, and make sure that you enjoy it.
I mean, I'm always telling women of color academics to think about their careers on a 30-year timeline, because if you think about it on a 30-year timeline, then it becomes easier to prioritize certain things. It allows you some space to not exhaust yourself, because you realize that actually if you want to have a 30-year career in this profession, you can't do everything in year one.
Yeah, that's such a good thing to emphasize. Something that I found really useful has been to create my own model of what kind of professor and person that I want to be. Because I had this tension with, should I be like this person? Should I be like this person? And no, I think that's the greatest lesson, that you, by being here, by having your own unique set of experiences and personality and whatever, you can create your own model of who you want to be in academia. And you don't have to be like other people who you have met. I've been in different academic settings, for example, conferences, where I walk into the main lobby and it just feels so tense. And people don't even care to really even listen to you or have a conversation about how you're doing. And so that, I think, as a first generation woman of color academic now, I don't have to do that. And we create our own spaces, and they feel really different. And so I feel nourished now every time I go to conferences, and that takes time. So if you are, starting out in graduate school, or if you're a new professor and you haven't felt that at conferences, come find me, because I will help. That is the best way to experience conferences. Once you have your people and you don't have to feel alienated.
Yeah, I think that's so true, because I hated going to conferences in my early graduate school, but now I actually like them because I can see people that I normally don't see. You're listening to Dr. Melissa Guzman, Assistant Professor in the Latino Studies Department at San Francisco State University. Dr. Guzman's research interests are on racialization, Latino sociology, migration, religion, and the criminalization of communities of color. So let's talk about your passion in terms of your research. And one of the things that I think is really appealing about your work is this concept of spiritual citizenship. I wondered if you could explain what you mean by this concept of spiritual citizenship and how that has been a useful concept in your work.
Thank you for asking me about this. Part of how I developed this concept of spiritual citizenship has a lot to do with my own personal experiences, being an immigrant from Mexico City and growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where my family ended up migrating when I was 9 years old. And really, even a more specific way of thinking about the root of this concept for me is trying to understand my grandmother's experience. So my abuelita Isabel, she's my mom's mom. She lived with us basically all our lives. And when I was about 10 years old was when my grandmother migrated to basically help take care of us in Michigan. And so back in Mexico, my abuelita Isabel, I remember her going to church all the time. This is Catholic church. She also had this beautiful image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, and she had it up in her room, and she brought that with her when she left Mexico to come live in Michigan. And I remember we all shared the same room, my two sisters and I, and she had it up on the wall. And I remember thinking, this must have been really important for her to bring. If she's carrying this around, like, she would still pray to the Virgen de Guadalupe. And then over time, She started hanging out with these women in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who were taking her to the Seventh-day Adventist church. She basically converted to being a Seventh-day Adventist. And I also saw that eventually she was starting to take away all of these physical remnants of being Catholic, to the point where she threw away the picture of the Virgen de Guadalupe. And so I wanted to understand this transformation, because it was in the context of my grandma feeling really lonely as an immigrant in our community. My parents were working, but my grandma was basically helping to labor, like taking care of us, cleaning the house, cooking. And one of her only ways to find community was going to this evangelical church. And the other mechanism that happened with us is that we had a visa when we came into this country, but those expire. So 5 years after we got the visas, we became undocumented. And so what does it mean, to be a legal outsider and to feel racism, discrimination, because you're in this white community where you feel like you're the only Mexican immigrant in the school, in the city? And so I always wanted to understand why my grandma was so attracted to this particular church. But then also, as I got older, my grandma became very focused on trying to get me to read the Bible all the time. And I hated it. But so once I started college, I started taking sociology of religion classes, philosophy of religion classes, and I wanted to understand my grandma's experience. This is just a long way of talking about the roots of this concept. So the way that Latino religious organizations participate in this process of helping undocumented immigrants belong to the United States, even when they don't have any sort of formal legal recognition in this country. And especially in the context of, criminalizing undocumented immigrants, of this shift in how we think about citizenship as not only something that is like a formal legal status, but it comes with a lot of economic and moral responsibilities. The role of churches in participating in this process of immigrants performing this desirable moral economic behaviors to frame themselves as being deserving of even occupying a space in this country, of being a desirable subject.
So if we think about migration, it's a very secular conversation. In what ways do you think we need to start paying attention to this relationship or intersection between religion and migration, religion and spirituality, as a way to actually understand the process of migration or the migrant experience?
Thank you for that question. So the way that I've framed my findings so far is I started out as a sociologist of religion, and I was having a hard time finding sociologists of religion who were looking at Latino evangelicals, first of all. And then there is this whole other body of literature that has tried to integrate, studies, ethnographies of immigrant communities, of immigrant religious communities. But the way that they're kind of framing these communities, sort of like, what are the benefits for new migrants in joining these local religious organizations? How does a local religious organization help a new immigrant maintain their ethnic ties, etc.? So it's all these positive benefits, right, of local religious communities. And that's sort of something that I expected to find before going into the field. I've been visiting Latino evangelical churches since I was 20 years old, throughout Michigan, in Fresno, now in the Bay Area. And I'm not evangelical. I'm not Catholic. And so I'm sort of this outsider trying to understand immigrant experiences within these settings. And I think that's the part that scholars of migration need to start thinking about, especially thinking about evangelical Christian identity. This becomes sort of a master status, right? This conversion experience. It's a whole new worldview and way of being that these churches are socializing Latino immigrants into. And that sort of becomes a primary way of viewing all of your struggles. And in that sense, it's empowering to look at how migrants in uncertain legal statuses are using their Christian identity in a way to reject legal status in the U.S. and to reject U.S. citizenship based on this like national belonging as the main thing that defines them, because their Christianity and their spiritual citizenship and being recognized as a child of God, if you will, becomes way more important because there's all these rituals and connections that they have with the church community where that takes center stage. And so if we ignore that very spiritual and community-based connections that are very much rooted in prayer, meeting up with church people, I mean, folks are spending so much time during the week going to church services, raising money for their church, praying for their communities to be safer, praying so that somebody passes their citizenship test. All of these ways that I think if you just look at it through a purely migration lens, that you're going to miss. But then also, if you're only looking for all of the positive ways that a religious community can help migrants, then you miss the ways that a system like crimmigration ends up inserting its tentacles into local religious communities. And that's sort of what I'm trying to examine.
So what is some of your plans for your future research? Where would you like to go next with some of the thinking around spiritual citizenship, migration, religion? What's up next for you?
I've been doing sort of mini ethnographies in Fresno, but also in Northern California, looking at the role of these local religious communities and sort of helping people think differently about legal status or about criminality. And so my next immediate project is based on this ethnography that I did in Fresno. It's a Mexican Baptist immigrant church, and they have a really interesting way of talking about deportation. And so this church is primarily serving Mexican immigrants, but also a lot of the temporary sort of farm workers, farm laborers in Fresno that are coming in and out. And so in interviewing the pastor, I was really shocked by hearing about the way that he talked about targeting or, I guess, evangelizing immigrants. And so he says that his church tries to focus on reaching these farm laborers because they're taking the word of God back and forth to their country. So there's this tool that he's using, this like ongoing labor demand and like ongoing migration flows that he's seeing as like good to make his church grow. But then he's also talking about deportation as being something good, because when someone gets deported from Fresno who has gone to his church, then that person is like a seed that will then convert others wherever they get sent to. And so there's this interesting discourse on deportation.
So then these deported migrants become the church's messengers for the word of God. That is really troubling.
So I'm thinking all of these different local churches and the way that they're getting us to think differently about sanctuary and the role of local religious communities in really advocating or perhaps recreating some of these same dangerous discourses about immigration, especially in this context, I think is going to be really important to focus on.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for coming on to Voces Críticas. It was great to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much.